Welcome to Episode 9 of Fixing America with J Mel. What people don't understand about conservative democracy. I begin this episode by reviewing the last decade of the American experience in governance. During that time, a large percentage of Americans have been unhappy and want changes in our government. A fellow comes along promising dramatic change that will restore America to greatness. He demonstrates a willingness to challenge existing norms and proposes a bold agenda that, if successfully implemented, would change fundamental concepts of governance that would allegedly restore family, cultural, and heritage values that had existed in times of prosperity, but remain a democracy. Sounds good, right? Well, he is elected and immediately goes on a crusade to destroy and rebuild the American bureaucracy and eliminate fraud and waste. He takes control of the legislative branch and boldly enhances his executive powers before the judicial branch can rule on the constitutionality of his actions. He aggressively, and without regard for its constitutionality, issues hundreds of executive orders which effectively dictate unilateral control over governmental departments and independent agencies. A wide range of dramatic changes occur that disrupt existing social, political, and economic systems. His leadership leads to global economic chaos and alienation of United States allies and unilaterally takes military action against two countries without threat to the United States and starts a war with Iran, all contrary to his campaign promises. What went wrong and why? To understand and address this problem, we must decipher the current regime's ultimate goal, understand its game plan to achieve that goal, and understand what our citizens think about the legitimacy of the governance, its elected leaders, and their desire, if any, to reject democracy in favor of autocracy. We begin with the current regime's ultimate goal. Having discussed that issue in earlier podcasts, I will assume our prior conclusion was correct, that the current administration's ultimate goal is to replace our democracy with an autocracy or an oligarchy. If you doubt that conclusion, I urge you to review prior episodes of this podcast, review the regime's prior conduct, and review again the lessons American history has or should have taught us. How this administration plans to reach that objective needs to be understood if we are to not only avoid catastrophe, but to come out of this historic period a stronger, more sustainable democracy. That question is particularly important to this episode because it reveals the devious psychology perpetrated through a sustained series of lie, deceit, and fraud propagandized on Americans. In particular, the regime lured citizens to accept conservative democracy as an interim pathway to autocracy, making the transition less obvious. That fraud involved the regime's creation of a strange psychological physiology called wokeism that still puzzles many people. It will be explained. The regime created an attitudinal human characteristic they call wokeness. They say it is evil, demonic, and un-American, and that all Democrats, liberals, and politically progressive Americans are afflicted with it. Their leaders and followers alike have difficulty defining it, but they profess to know and understand it and its blight on our democracy. However, it is now well established what it means. They are simply reluctant or refuse to define it aloud because it describes people who are, quote, aware of social inequalities, like racism, sexism, economic inequality, and LGBTQ plus rights, with a desire and willingness to address them, end quote. In other words, they created a term that by normal standards is a good character trait, but insist it is a bad one. You are deemed woke if you are aware of social inequalities and desire to fix that social problem. They say you are a bad person for wanting to help your friends and neighbors. Well, that certainly establishes its strangeness, but it does not explain why or how it contributes to the regime's pathway to authoritarianism. To understand that, we must digest the following long-standing definitions of conservative and liberal democracy. Conservative democracy describes a democratic system emphasizing traditional values, social stability, and the preservation of established institutions. It prioritizes the collective community, national heritage, and the organic continuity of society. It often integrates religious tradition into public life. Liberal democracy, on the other hand, places a strong emphasis on universal individual rights, civil liberties, human rights, and the rule of law. It promotes separation of powers, checks and balances of the three branches, and protection of minority rights. It seeks an open society with protected freedom of speech and association, private property, and a market-driven economy. As we will discuss in much more detail later in this episode and future episodes, the regime's use of the conservative democracy label is designed to accomplish two things. First, it identifies and demonizes liberals, Democrats, and social progressives. It manufactures a foe, and it creates a scapegoat as part of their insurrection plan, a plan using the conservative democracy as a facade through which to morph it into an imperial, oligarchic, or authoritarian form of government. Second, it conforms to the basic characteristics or tenets of a democracy, but replaces universal individual rights, freedom of religion, freedom of speech and association, civil liberties, separation of powers, and a pluralistic open society with tradition, heritage, social order, contained communities, and integrates religious tradition into public life. In other words, it is the old switcheroo. You think you are getting a democracy. Instead, you are getting a modified version of autocracy. We will explore each tenet of a liberal democracy in subsequent episodes and compare and contrast them to the tenets of a conservative democracy. Before we get to that, we need to address the last question. What do the people of our country believe about the status of our current government? Is it headed in the right direction? And what form of governance would be acceptable? So, what do our citizens want today? And what do they believe they are going to get from this new leadership? For answers, I explored the current status of American sentiment about the state of our democracy. The Pew Research Center research shows that 65% of our citizens say weakening democracy is a critical threat to the country. 69% are dissatisfied with how democracy is working, and 68% say the United States used to be a good example of democracy, but isn't anymore. A recent Chicago Council on Global Affairs survey shows that 70% show strong concern about democratic norms, institutions, and fairness, but continue, and this is important, they continue to support democracy itself as the best system. This leads to a point of optimism. A vast majority of our people believe our democracy is broken and needs fixing, but they have not abandoned it as a preferred form of government. That sentiment means the regime's plan to first morph through a conservative democracy on its way to autocracy is smart, since the conversion from conservative democracy to autocracy would logically have a smoother pathway. I want to believe that most right-leaning citizens don't yet believe they are headed towards an autocracy and didn't vote for that. Instead, I think they favor and believe they voted for the installation of a conservative democracy. I also want to believe they thought we would still have a democracy, even understanding that executive powers would have to be significantly increased in order to destroy and rebuild the federal bureaucracy and make other organic changes. But based on my research, such an animal, that is a conservative democracy, exists, at least in theory. It has some of the tenets common to a democracy, but it deviates substantially from the ideal democracy to accommodate the eradication of wokeness, strengthen its theocratic base, and accommodate autocratic leadership, making it remarkably close to an autocracy. Stated differently, it puts us closer to an autocracy, or makes conversion to it easier. If the foregoing statistics and my gut feelings are correct, the millions of MAGA supporters are not hell-bent on changing from a government of, by, and for the people to an autocracy, oligarchy, or dictatorship. That means we still have a chance to reach a compromise with that group of people. We are now ready to discuss the pros and cons of liberal versus conservative democracy, as opposed to the differences between democracy versus fascism or totalitarianism, etc. We are ready because we can reasonably predict there is a good chance Trump's base is expecting him to deliver some form of a democracy and will reject a full-throated autocratic takeover. We are probably still talking the same language with our right-wing neighbors when we talk about democracies. And to an extent, that is true, and we need to converse with them because liberal and conservative democracies share many of the same tenets. If our society is generally agreeable to keep a democratic form of government, we have a common ground of agreement from which to hold open, meaningful dialogues. That could erase or minimize the sharp, painful divisions within our country. But in all candor, I must confess my belief that the conflict at the core of our country's division is the belief that only, quote, white property owners, end quote, should participate in civic affairs. I fear it still goes back to the long-standing belief that some groups of people are superior to others by nature's or divine will. In other words, our country's preeminent declaration that all men are created equal has yet to be universally accepted in this country. And that presents a problem because, briefly stated, a liberal democracy is based on pluralism, diversity, universal respect for human rights and freedoms, and secularism. A conservative democracy is based on maintaining and giving special privileges to cultures, heritage, social orders, and community values. Those things are important in a society. The problem is it tends to give favor to certain groups of people based on race, heritage, and wealth, etc. So, for example, race and gender rights and freedoms are addressed more softly, which can and frequently does lead to racial and gender inequality in the conservative brand. For example, segregation was a long-standing norm in the South. The Constitution, under a conservative democracy, might see integration as a white person's right and have that custom outweigh the concept of equal justice for all. Whereas in a liberal democracy, the constitutional tenets are viewed more strictly to govern the needs of a society, without interference in individual customs while guaranteeing individual rights on a universal basis. Therefore, as we discuss how to fix America, we need to understand the differences between the liberal and conservative ideologies and know how to explain why and how to reconcile them into a harmonious form of government that will work for everyone. In large part, harmonizing them involves adopting the tenets of a liberal democracy while incorporating wholesome respect for the meaningful core values of the conservative democracy. As used hereinafter, core values and tenets are used interchangeably. I will address each topic in what I believe to be its relative importance when we address those matters in the next podcast. One final thought as you ponder how to fix the all men are created equal problem. Why can't government be accepted as necessary with its function restricted to serving society generally? Why can't government be accepted as the protector of the individual rights and freedoms of all citizens equally? Not for some divine reason, but to make life better for all and to preserve peace. Thank you for listening. See you next time. Remember to like, leave a comment, start a chat, leave a note, or subscribe. Be safe and resist. J Mel.